What happens when a farmer decides to buy a caged giant? This isn't the start of a fairy tale, but a story etched in the mud and prejudice of a time that feared anything it could not understand. We are in Blackwood Hollow, a place where the 19th century feels ancient, a town caught between the harvest and the coming winter, and steeped in a superstitions as deep and cold as the local well. At the heart of its annual fair, past the stalls selling dried apples and questionable tonics, is an attraction that draws the largest crowd. It is not a prize-winning pig or a quilting bee, it is a cage, and inside that cage is a woman named Ilara. Her story, the one they whisper and shout, is that of the giant widow, a monster responsible for her own husband's death. And today you will learn the truth of what happened in that muddy town square, a truth that begins not with a roar, but with a silence so profound it could break your heart. The air itself is an assault, a thick concoction of damp earth, nervous livestock, and the sweet, cloying smell of rotting fruit. Some of that fruit, bruised and half-eaten, is thrown by children who are too young to understand the cruelty they are performing, only that the adults around them approve. They hurl their small insults at the iron-barred cage where Ilara sits, a monument of human misery. She is a woman of colossal stature, well over 7 feet tall, with shoulders that speak of a strength she has never been allowed to use for her own good. Her massive frame is folded into the cramped space, an eagle forced into a sparrow's cage, her knees drawn up to her chest in a posture of permanent defense. Her hair, a long and tangled curtain of dark brown, hangs over her face, shielding her from the hundreds of eyes that stare but cannot truly see her. Her stillness is a language of its own. It is not the defiant stillness of a cornered predator, but the utter stillness of a spirit that has surrendered. It is the silence of a soul that has been told, day after day, that its very existence is a curse. The crowd feeds on this silence, their fear a palpable thing, a living wall of prejudice that has followed Ilara from the day she was born. It is this fear that has built her cage, bar by bar, long before the showman Master Borin ever turned a key in its lock. He circles the cage now, a predator in his own right, his voice a slick and oily thing that slithers through the crowd. He is a master of his craft, weaving a narrative of unnatural power, of a cursed woman whose touch brings ruin. He points a gloved finger, and the crowd shivers with a delicious, morbid thrill. Master Borin tells them of the storm, the falling oak, the husband crushed in his sleep. He paints a picture of a monstrous wife who walked away without a scratch, her unnatural size a shield against God's own fury. He does not speak of her grief. He does not speak of the love she lost. He speaks only of the spectacle, the beast, the unnatural thing, captured for their entertainment and their protection. And Ilara, behind the veil of her hair, endures it. Each word is a stone, adding to the weight that has been pressing down on her since she was a child. To understand the depth of this public torment, you have to understand the quiet, simple dream it destroyed. She never asked for greatness, only for normalcy. A small garden to tend, a walk through the market without causing a panic, the simple human dignity of being seen as a person. And, have you ever felt that? Perhaps not in a cage at a village fair, but in your own life. Have you ever felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, all seeing a version of you that isn't real? Have you ever been judged by a story someone else created, a label that erases everything you truly are inside? If you have, even for a moment, then you know a fraction of the agony that Ilara was breathing in that cage. It is a unique and terrible loneliness, to be surrounded by people yet be completely and utterly alone. That feeling, that desperate need to scream, "That's not who I am," is a cage of its own, and it is a prison many of us have known. From the edge of the jeering crowd, a man watches. He is not like the others. His name is Silas, a farmer in his late 30s, a man whose own story is written in the lines on his face and the permanent sorrow in his eyes. He is a widower, a fact the town has long since forgotten, but a wound that has never fully healed for him. His hands are calloused from a lifetime of wrestling a living from the stubborn soil, and his silence is of a different kind than Ilara's. His is the quiet of a man who listens more than he speaks, who observes the world with a deep, resonant ache. He isn't looking at the spectacle, he is looking at the woman. He sees the slight tremor in her massive shoulders, the way she curls into herself to seem smaller, and in the shame that radiates from her, he sees a reflection of his own grief, his own isolation. He understands injustice. He understands how a community in its fear can turn on its own. He sees not a monster, but a soul enduring an agony he knows all too well. The world has punished her for being different, just as it had left him adrift in his own sea of loss. While the others see a threat, he sees a reflection of the world's casual cruelty, a cruelty that breaks the gentlest spirits. Master Borin, sensing his performance is reaching its peak, raises his hands for silence. His voice booms with false generosity, announcing that for a small price someone in the crowd can have the honor of feeding the beast, of seeing if it will bite. The suggestion is met with a wave of cruel laughter, another calculated twist of the knife to further humiliate the woman in the cage. The laughter is the worst part. It is a sound that strips away the last vestiges of her humanity. It reduces her grief, her life, her very being into a joke for the entertainment of strangers. Ilara flinches, a barely perceptible movement, but Silas sees it. He sees it as clearly as if a physical blow had been struck, and in that moment, something within him, a quiet resolve that had been dormant for years, finally ignites. The laughter continues, a chorus of mockery and fear, as Borin pretends to look for a bidder, a participant in his cruel game. The crowd plays along, men nudging each other, daring one another to step forward. It is a game, and Ilara is the prize nobody wants. But then, a voice cuts. Through the noise, it is not loud, but it is firm, carrying a weight that makes the laughter falter and die. "I'll make you an offer." The words hang in the suddenly silent air. Every head turns, searching for the source. It is Silas. He steps forward, out from the shadows of the crowd, his boots sinking into the same mud that surrounds Ilara's cage. He looks directly at Master Borin, his gaze unwavering. The showman, momentarily thrown off his script, recovers with a smirk. He assumes the farmer is part of the joke, a new player in the game. He plays along, his voice dripping with condescension, asking what a simple farmer could possibly offer for such a prize. The crowd waits, expecting the punchline. They expect Silas to offer a sack of potatoes or a lamé chicken to continue the farce. But Silas does not smile. He reaches into his coat, his movements deliberate and slow. He pulls out a worn leather pouch, heavy with the metallic clink of coins. It is his entire season's earnings, every penny he had saved, the sum of a year's worth of back-breaking labor under the sun and in the rain. He holds it up, not with a flourish, but with a quiet finality. "This," he says, his voice steady, "I'll give you all of it, not to feed her, but to buy her." The silence that follows is absolute. A thick, stunned blanket that smothers the entire fairground. The villagers stare, their mouths agape. This is no longer a joke. This is madness. Master Borin's eyes widen, his greed wrestling with his confusion. He sees the weight of the pouch and his calculations are swift. The farmer is a fool, but his money is real, more real than the fear Borin had been selling all afternoon. With a greedy snatch, he takes the pouch, his eyes gleaming. The deal is done. The beast is sold. The crowd murmurs, a wave of disbelief and suspicion rippling through them. What could a man like Silas possibly want with a creature like her? The rusty lock on the cage groans as Borin turns the key. The sound is a shock, and Ilara, who had been lost in her own world of shame, looks up for the first time. Through the curtain of her hair, she sees the cage door swing open. Her heart hammers against her ribs. She expects more torment, a new kind of cruelty she cannot yet imagine. She sees the farmer Silas approaching. She shrinks back, pressing herself against the cold iron bars at the back of the cage, bracing for whatever comes next. The entire town of Blackwood Hollow holds its breath, watching as the quiet farmer stands before the open door of the giant's cage, the fate of two broken souls hanging in the balance. The real story was not ending. It was just about to begin. The journey from the fairground to Silas's farm was a walk through a world of ghosts. The boisterous noise of the market had been replaced by a silence that was far more menacing. It was a silence filled with the slam of distant shutters, the twitch of curtains in windows, and the weight of 100 unseen eyes boring into their backs. Silas did not lead Ilara with a rope like a purchased animal. He walked beside her, his pace measured, his gaze fixed on the muddy track ahead. He did not try to fill the silence with words, for he knew that any words he offered now would be meaningless, hollow sounds against the mountain of her pain. For Ilara, this wasn't freedom. It was merely an exchange of one cage for another, the iron bars of the fair replaced by the invisible, suffocating walls of a town's judgment. Each step was an agony, Her colossal frame, so used to being a spectacle, now felt like a beacon of shame in the quiet judgment of the afternoon light. They walked for nearly an hour, leaving the clustered homes of Blackwood Hollow behind, and venturing into the sparse, hard-scrabble land that the less fortunate farmers worked. Silas's farm was the last one on the path before the woods thickened into an impassable tangle. It was a place that seemed to be holding its breath. The farmhouse was small, its paint faded to the color of bone. A section of the fence sagged like a tired old man leaning on a cane, and the fields, even to Ilara's untrained eye, looked stubborn and rocky, a place where a harvest was not given, but torn from the earth through sheer will. This was not a place of prosperity, it was a place of survival, a testament to the solitary struggle of the man who walked beside her. It was a landscape that mirrored his soul, weathered, lonely, and marked by a quiet, enduring resilience. When they reached the house, Silas opened the door and stood aside, a simple gesture of respect that felt as foreign to Ilara as a forgotten language. She hesitated on the threshold, her great height forcing her to stoop to even consider entering. The inside was sparse but clean, a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth swept clean of ash, but the air was thick with absence. It was the home of a man living with a ghost, and Ilara, who was so accustomed to being the monster in the story, felt like an intruder on a private sorrow. She could see the faint outline in the dust on the mantelpiece, where another small portrait might have once sat, and she knew, with the certainty of the grieving, that she was standing in a house built for 2 but inhabited by 1 for a very long time. To understand the woman who stood frozen in that doorway, you have to travel back, past the cage and the whispers, to a small cabin nestled so deep in the woods that the town was just a rumor on the wind. She was born into the loving hands of parents who saw not a giant, but their daughter, yet their love was a flickering candle against the gale-force wind of the world's fear. As she grew and grew and grew, their love became tinged with a terrible anxiety. They saw how other children would stop their games and stare, how their parents would pull them close, their faces tight with suspicion. Ilara learned to walk with her shoulders hunched and her eyes on the ground, a child trying to shrink a body that was built on a scale the world was not ready for. Have you ever felt too big for the world around you? Not your body, perhaps, but your dreams, your feelings, your quietest hopes. Have you ever felt the need to make yourself smaller, to fold yourself up so as not to disturb those who live in smaller, neater boxes? That was Ilara's entire childhood. Her immense physical strength was a secret she was taught to hide, a source of shame rather than pride. While other boys learned to chop wood and other girls learned to sew, Ilara learned the crushing arithmetic of her own existence, that her size was a debt she would have to spend her entire life repaying through silence and submission. Her every movement was a calculation, an effort to be less, to take up less space, to be anything other than what she was. Her only dream was for the smallest, most ordinary of lives. She would sit at the edge of her parents' small garden, her massive hands, capable of uprooting a small tree, gently tending to a single fragile sprout. She dreamed of the anonymity of a market, of being able to smell the fresh-baked bread without feeling the heat of a dozen stares on her neck. She longed for the simple dignity of being seen as a woman, not a phenomenon. This quiet, desperate yearning for normalcy was the core of her being, a gentle soul trapped in an intimidating vessel, a heart that beat with a soft and steady rhythm inside a chest that the world saw as a weapon. Then, for a brief, miraculous time, her dream came true. His name was Thomas. He was a man from the village, but not of it. A maker of clocks, a man who understood the intricate, delicate workings of things. He was considered an oddity himself, more comfortable with gears and springs than with people. He was not intimidated by Ilara's size. He was fascinated by the quiet grace she tried so hard to conceal. He looked at her and saw not a giant, but the sad and lonely girl she had been forced to become. He was the first person to ever ask her what she thought, to listen to the soft, hesitant voice she rarely used. Their courtship was a secret, a series of stolen moments in the woods where she could finally stand up straight and breathe. Their marriage was a scandal, a union that the town treated as an act of defiance against the natural order of things. But in the small cabin they built with their own hands, Ilara knew a peace she had never believed possible. Thomas loved her size. He would ask her to lift things he could not as a command but as a request between partners. He celebrated the strength she had always been taught to fear. For 3 years, she was not the giant of Blackwood Hollow. She was simply Ilara, a wife, a partner, a woman in love. She tended her own small garden. She walked with her head held high, at least within the protective circle of their land. It was a fragile, beautiful world, a soap bubble of happiness that she prayed would never burst. But the world of Blackwood Hollow is a hard one, and nature is indifferent to the small joys of men and women. The winter that took Thomas was the cruelest in living memory. It came with a wind that screamed like a banshee and a snow that buried fences and erased paths. The storm raged for days, a relentless assault that trapped them in their cabin. On the third night, the wind reached a fever pitch. There was a sound like the sky itself was tearing apart, a deafening crack of ancient wood giving way. The giant oak that had sheltered their home for 100 years, a tree they had often sat beneath, came crashing down upon their roof. It happened in an instant. The world became a splintered chaos of wood, snow, and darkness. When Ilara came to, she was buried in debris, her body bruised and scratched but miraculously unbroken. Her unnatural size, the very thing she had always cursed, had protected her, her broad back taking the brunt of a collapsed beam that would have crushed anyone else. But Thomas, he was gone. She dug through the wreckage with her bare hands, the splinters tearing at her skin, screaming his name into the howling wind until her voice was a raw, bloody whisper. She found him under the main roof beam, his gentle, clever hand still. The silence that followed his death was the loudest sound she had ever heard. When the storm finally broke and the villagers dug their way out, they found her sitting in the ruins, cradling Thomas's body, her face a mask of frozen, uncomprehending grief. But they did not see a grieving widow. They saw a monster who had survived a catastrophe that had killed a normal man. Her survival was not a miracle. It was evidence of her unnaturalness. The whispers started immediately like sparks in dry tinder. The storm wasn't random. The tree wasn't just old. Her presence, her very being, had drawn the disaster. She was a curse, a bad omen who had finally claimed the life of the foolish man who had dared to love her. Her grief was not allowed. The town stole it from her, replacing it with their own fear and suspicion. They looked at her strength, the strength that had been a source of pride for Thomas, and they called it a weapon. They saw her survival as proof of her guilt. She had been the author of her own brief happiness, and now they made her the author of her own unending misery. She was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of blame, with the anchor of her husband's love ripped away. Her spirit, already so fragile, shattered completely. She began to believe them. Perhaps she was a curse, perhaps her very existence brought ruin. It was into this abyss of self-loathing that Master Borin had stepped. He had heard the whispers, the legend of the giant widow growing in the fertile soil of the town's superstition. He found Ilara not in a cabin, but in the shell of a woman. He did not come with chains and threats. He came with a silken voice and a twisted kind of sympathy. He told her he understood her guilt. He told her he could offer her a form of penance, a way to atone for the sin of her own existence. He would display her, he said, not for profit, but so the world could see the danger she represented. It was a public service, and she, broken and convinced of her own monstrosity, had agreed. The cage was not a prison he forced upon her. It was a punishment she walked into willingly, believing with every fibre of her being that she deserved it. And so she stood now, on the threshold of another man's house, a man who had paid for her freedom with the sum of his own hard life. He held out a wooden bowl of thin stew, a simple offering that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. He had bought her, yes. He had opened the cage door, but what does freedom mean to a soul that has forgotten it ever existed? The physical bars were gone, but the prison of her past, of the town's hatred and her own crushing guilt, was a cage she carried deep within her. The quiet farmer had made his move, an impossible gesture of defiance. But what he could not know was that the true battle was not against the town of Blackwood Hollow, but against the ghosts that lived behind Ilara's silent, haunted eyes. The wedding, if one could call it that, was not a ceremony of union but a final act of separation. It took place in the cold, cavernous silence of the town church, a space that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The only witnesses were the disapproving eyes of the saints painted on the dusty stained glass, and the town's priest, a man named Father Michael, whose every word felt heavy with reluctance. He rushed through the rites as if the words themselves might catch fire in his mouth, his gaze never quite settling on the impossible couple before him. There were no flowers, no well-wishes, only the echoing finality of two names being joined under a roof of judgment. For Ilara, who stood stooped beneath the high arches, it felt like a sentencing. She had exchanged an iron cage for a gilded one, a marriage certificate written in the ink of public scorn. Silas stood beside her, his quiet solidity the only anchor in a swirling sea of shame. He said his vows in a low, steady voice, a promise made not to God or the town, but directly to the haunted woman by his side. Their first night on the farm was draped in a silence that had teeth. Ilara did not know how to be a wife, only how to be a burden. She moved through the small farmhouse with a crushing awareness of her own scale, her shoulders brushing doorframes, her very presence seeming to shrink the meager space. She expected orders, a list of chores, a justification for the price he had paid for her. Instead, Silas simply placed a bowl of warm broth on the table, took the other chair and ate without a word, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. The quiet was not empty, it was filled with the things they could not say. He could not ask about the cage, and she could not speak. Of the guilt that was a physical weight in her chest. She felt a flicker of gratitude so profound it was painful, but it was immediately smothered by a wave of terror. She had not escaped her curse, she had simply brought it into this quiet man's home, and she waited with the certainty of the damned, for it to destroy him too. The town did not make them wait long. They awoke the next morning not to the crowing of the rooster, but to the sight of devastation. During the night, a group of men, their courage fueled by cheap ale, and a shared simmering hatred had descended upon the farm. The fence that marked the boundary of Silas's land, the one he had painstakingly mended year after year, had been torn down. Posts were ripped from the earth and cast aside, the rails splintered and broken. It was an act of violation, a clear and brutal message. You are not welcome here. This land is ours, and you have brought a blight upon it. Silas stood on his porch, his face a mask of stone, and looked at the ruin. He said nothing, but Ilara saw the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. She, however, saw something different. She did not see an act of vandalism against a farmer. She saw the first invoice for her freedom, the first price Silas had to pay for his kindness, and she knew with a cold sickness in her stomach that the debt was far from settled. This first attack sealed Ilara's lips. Where there had been a hesitant, fearful silence before, there was now a deliberate, absolute one. She began to believe that her voice itself was a vector for the curse, that to speak would be to invite more disaster upon Silas, and so she communicated through action. From dawn until long after dusk she worked. She poured all her grief, all her guilt, and all her terrifying, unnatural strength into the stubborn soil of his farm. She cleared a field of stones in a single day, her massive hands pulling boulders from the earth that would have taken 2 men and a mule to move. She lifted fallen logs, mended the broken fence with new posts. She sank deep into the ground and worked with a silent, desperate ferocity that was both magnificent and heartbreaking to watch. It was not labor, it was penance. Every stone she moved was a word of apology she could not speak. Every post she set was a prayer for his safety. She was trying to build a fortress of her own hard work around him, hoping it could protect him from the storm that was her very existence. For Silas, this was a new kind of agony. He had freed a woman from a cage only to watch her build a new one around her own heart. He would try to speak to her, his voice gentle as he worked alongside her. He would tell her about the land, about his late wife, about the simple hopes he once had. He was offering her pieces of his own broken life, hoping she might offer him a piece of hers in return. But she would only look at him with those wide, haunted eyes, her expression a mixture of gratitude and terror, before turning back to her work. Her silence was a wall he could not breach, a constant heartbreaking reminder that he had bought her body but had not yet earned her soul. He was fighting a war against the town's hatred, but he was also fighting a ghost inside his own home, and he was beginning to fear that the ghost was the more formidable enemy. He was a lonely man who had brought home a woman who was the loneliest soul he had ever known, and together they were 2 separate islands of silence in a shared sea of misery. The town's cruelty soon escalated from vandalism to something far more sinister. A week after the fence was destroyed, Silas went to draw water from the well and was hit by a stench so vile it made him gag. He peered down into the darkness and saw the bloated, floating carcass of a sheep, its wool matted and its eyes staring blankly at the sky. Someone had crept onto his land in the dead of night and poisoned their only source of water. This was no longer a warning. It was a threat of slow, agonizing death. It was an act of profound, calculated malice, a declaration that they would not be allowed to survive. They would be choked out, starved of the most basic element of life. The act was so cruel, so deeply personal, that it spoke of a hatred that had festered for years, a fear that had turned into a monstrous living thing. Ilara saw the dead animal, and it was as if she were looking at her own reflection. She was the poison in the well, the rot that spoiled everything clean and good. And have you ever felt that? Have you ever been made to feel like you are the source of the trouble, the poison in someone else's well? It is a terrible burden to carry, the belief that your presence alone is enough to cause pain, that your very shadow brings a chill to the room. It is a lie that, when whispered often enough by the world, can begin to sound like the truth. You start to believe it. You start to see every misfortune, every stumble, every harsh word as a direct result of your own flawed existence. It is a cage of the mind, more effective than any iron bars because it is one you lock from the inside. Ilara was trapped in that cage, and every new act of cruelty from the town was just another turn of the key, locking her deeper inside her own despair. The next assault was even more direct. A word screamed in the color of blood. One morning, the rising sun revealed a new horror painted across the wide planks of their barn, in huge, dripping red. Letters was a single word: witch. The paint was still fresh, the color of a fresh slaughter. It was the town's final verdict, the ultimate condemnation. They had moved beyond whispers and rumors and had now made a public accusation, one that, in a place like Blackwood Hollow, was as good as a death sentence. The word hung in the air, a permanent stain not just on the wood, but on their lives. It was the culmination of every fear, every superstition, every bit of malice they had faced. For Ilara, seeing that word was like looking in a mirror. It was the name she had secretly called herself in the darkest hours of her grief. They had finally seen the monster she knew herself to be, and she felt a strange, horrifying sense of relief. The pretending was over. The physical attacks were soon followed by a quieter, more insidious form of violence. The town began to starve them out. When Silas hitched his horse and rode to the general store, his pouch of coins ready, he was met with a wall of silence. The store owner, a man he had known his entire life, suddenly became very busy counting barrels, refusing to meet his eye. At the blacksmith's, he was told the forge was cold, and there was no time to shoe his horse. He tried to sell the few bushels of late-season apples he had harvested, but the market turned their backs on him as if he were a leper. The invisible walls of prejudice had become real. They were an island, cut off from the mainland of the community, with no way to buy seed for the winter wheat, no way to get salt to cure meat, no way to purchase the simple necessities of survival. The town was united in its effort to erase them, to let the coming winter do the dirty work that their own hands were too cowardly to perform. Silas bore this new burden with the same quiet stoicism that defined him, but Ilara saw the toll it was taking. She saw the new lines of worry etched around his eyes, the way he would stand at the edge of his unplanted fields and stare at the horizon, his shoulders slumped with a weight that even she could not lift. He was growing thinner, his already lean frame becoming gaunt. He was a good man, a decent man, being systematically destroyed for a single act of compassion. He had tried to save her, and in doing so he had doomed himself. The guilt inside Ilara was no longer a quiet ache. It was a raging fire. She would watch him sleep, his face, for once, free from the strain of the day, and her heart would break. She was a disease, and he was wasting away from it. The knowledge that she was the cause of his slow destruction became unbearable. It twisted her love for him into a weapon against herself. She had brought the cage with her, and now he was trapped inside it too. Her mind began to circle a single terrible thought. The only way to save him was to remove the curse. The only way to remove the curse was to remove herself. The idea took root in the barren soil of her despair and grew into a desperate, painful plan. If she were gone, the town's hatred would lose its focus. They might, in time, forgive Silas for his moment of madness. They might let him back into the fold. He could survive, but not with her. Her presence was his death sentence. Her absence was his only hope. The decision was made on the day the first snow fell. It came not as a gentle blanket, but as a flurry of hard, sharp flakes, driven by a wind that moaned through the cracks in the farmhouse walls. It was the harbinger of the long, hungry winter to come. That night, as Silas slept the fitful sleep of the exhausted and the worried, Ilara rose from her pallet by the hearth. She moved with the silence of a ghost, her huge frame making no sound on the wooden floor. She gathered a small, hard loaf of bread and a skin of water. She pulled on her worn cloak and stood at the door, her hand on the simple wooden latch. She looked back at the sleeping man, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the fire, and a single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was the cruelest act of love she could imagine. To save him, she had to abandon him. She was about to step out into the blizzard, to walk into the unforgiving wilderness and disappear, to finally give the town the monster they wanted, one swallowed by the woods, and in doing so perhaps finally set the man who saved her free. The latch was cold against her palm, a final, unforgiving touch from a world she was about to leave behind. Ilara slipped out of the farmhouse like a ghost, her enormous frame moving with a practiced silence, born from a lifetime of trying to be smaller than she was. The blizzard hit her not as a blanket, but as a physical blow. The wind, a shrieking, invisible beast, tore at her cloak and filled the air with a blinding chaos of white. Each snowflake was a tiny needle against her skin. In that moment, she was not a woman, not a giant, but just another lost thing being swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. This was not an act of escape. It was an act of erasure. She was a stain she was trying to wash away with the snow, a curse she was attempting to bury in the frozen earth, all for the sake of the one man who had looked at her and seen a person. Her heart, a heavy stone in her chest, ached with a love so profound it could only express itself as a final, desperate act of self-destruction. Inside, Silas was jolted from his fitful sleep by a presence that was not there. It was the cold, an unnatural, invasive cold that had crept into the small house and settled in the very marrow of his bones. He sat up, his breath misting in the air, and saw the source. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the draught, a dark, gaping mouth that had let the storm inside. And beside the hearth, the small pallet where Ilara slept was empty. A cold far deeper than the winter night seized him. It was the familiar, gut-wrenching certainty of loss. A ghost he had lived with for years, now, returned with a terrifying new face. He scrambled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the frigid floorboards, and threw the door open to the screaming wind. There, in the freshly fallen snow, he saw them, a set of footprints, impossibly large, already beginning to soften and disappear under the relentless assault of the blizzard. He had not freed her. He had only given her a new wilderness to get lost in. He moved with a desperate urgency, pulling on his boots and heavy coat, his mind a whirlwind of fear. He had to find her. He would not lose another soul to the cruelty of this world. He grabbed a lantern, though he knew its feeble light would be next to useless in the whiteout, and was about to step out into the storm when a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate clang, a sound of pure panic, the town bell. It was not the steady, rhythmic toll for a Sunday service, but the wild, chaotic ringing that meant only one thing: disaster, fire. The sound tore through the night, a cry for help from the very people who had tried to destroy him, and for a heart-stopping moment, Silas was torn between two impossible duties: the woman he had sworn to protect, and the community that had cast him out. Miles away, lost and stumbling through the deepening drifts, Ilara had almost surrendered. The cold was a creeping numbness, a sweet and deadly lullaby, urging her to lie down, to rest, to let the snow become her final blanket. Her desperate act of love was turning into a slow, lonely suicide. But then she saw it. Through the swirling curtain of white, a faint, unholy orange glow appeared on the horizon. It pulsed against the dark underbelly of the storm clouds, a beacon in the blinding chaos. At first, she thought it was a trick of her freezing mind, an apparition, but the light grew stronger, angrier, painting the blizzard in hues of blood and fire. It gave her something she had lost, a direction. Without thinking, driven by an instinct, she did. Not understand, she turned her weary body toward the light and began to walk, one heavy, agonizing step at a time, drawn toward the very town she had been fleeing. The source of the glow was the town's grist mill, the heart of Blackwood Hollow's winter survival. By the time Ilara reached the edge of the woods overlooking the town, it was a roaring inferno. The wind that had been her tormentor in the wilderness was now the fire's greatest ally, fanning the flames into a furious vortex that devoured the dry timber of the old building. The entire town was gathered, their faces illuminated by the terrible light, their expressions a mixture of horror and utter helplessness. They were watching their winter supply of grain, their very hope of surviving until the spring thaw, turn to ash before their eyes. They were a community united, for the first time in months, by a shared and absolute despair. They were about to learn that prejudice is a luxury that only the safe and the well-fed can afford. Silas had made his choice. He had run for the town, praying that Ilara, in her flight, might have been drawn to the same commotion. As he arrived, breathless, at the edge of the crowd, he saw her. She emerged from the trees like a spectre from a nightmare, a towering figure caked in snow, her eyes wide with a horrified awe as she stared at the blaze. A collective gasp rippled through the townsfolk. The witch. She had come. In their fear-addled minds, her appearance at the scene of the disaster was not a coincidence. It was a confirmation. She was the cause, the curse made manifest, come to watch them burn. The whispers started instantly, a venomous hiss that spread through the crowd, even over the roar of the flames. But their accusations died in their throats as a new sound of terror erupted from the mill itself. With a deafening crack, a massive support beam, glowing like a hot coal, gave way and crashed down, blocking the main entrance. Screams erupted from within the burning structure. A half-dozen men who had been making a futile attempt to save sacks of flour were now trapped. One of them was the son of the village elder, the very young man who had led the party that had torn down Silas's fence. The crowd surged forward, then fell back, driven by a wall of heat and the terrifying realization that there was no way to get to them. The roof was groaning, ready to collapse. It was no longer a disaster. It was a tomb. Silas saw the horror unfold and grabbed Ilara's arm, his voice desperate. "No," he pleaded, "don't. They'll blame you for this too." He was trying to pull her away, to shield her from their hatred, to save her from their inevitable, twisted judgment. But Ilara was no longer listening to him. She was no longer listening to the whispers of the crowd or the voice of her own guilt. She was listening to the screams of dying men. In that moment, something inside her, a dam of grief and silence and shame that had been building for years, finally broke. She looked at the terrified faces in the crowd, the same faces that had jeered at her in the cage, and she did not see her tormentors. She saw people, and she saw that she, the monster they had created, was the only one who could save them. With a strength that came not from her muscles but from a place of deep-buried humanity, she pulled her arm free from Silas's grasp, and then, for the first time since the day Thomas died, she opened her mouth and let out a sound. It was not a word but a roar, a sound of such profound primal power that it momentarily silenced the fire and the wind. It was the voice of every injustice, every stone thrown, every whispered curse, all of it forged into a single defiant cry. And what about you? Watching this story unfold from the comfort of your world, if you had the power to save the very people who had tried to destroy you, who had poisoned your well and painted your home with words of hate, would you find that courage? Would you run into the fire for those who threw stones and spat at your feet? It is a question that defines who we are, not in the easy moments of sunshine and peace, but in the heart of the blaze, when everything is on the line and the only thing guiding you is the compass of your own soul. It is the hardest choice a person can ever make, to offer grace to those who have only ever shown you cruelty. Ilara did not hesitate. She ran. Her massive legs churned through the deep snow, each stride covering the ground with an impossible speed. The crowd, which had been a solid wall of bodies, parted before her as if by magic, their faces a canvas of disbelief and terror. She did not slow as she reached the burning mill, ignoring the searing heat that blistered her skin and the thick, choking smoke that filled her lungs. She reached the collapsed entrance and planted her feet in the mud and ash, her body a titan set against a backdrop of hellfire. She looked up at the massive, glowing beam, the single piece of burning wood that stood between life and death for the men trapped inside. She was no longer running from her past. She was running toward her destiny, and what was to come in the next few moments would not just be the most decisive night of her life. It would be the night that decided if Blackwood Hollow itself deserved to have a future. Her feet did not feel the snow. The world had narrowed to a single roaring tunnel of light and sound, with the burning mill at its end. The crowd was a blur of pale, terrified faces, a gallery of her tormentors now frozen in a new kind of fear. She did not see them. She saw only the trapped, desperate figures silhouetted against the flames, and she heard only the screams that echoed the silent ones she had carried in her own heart for years. There was no thought, no plan, only a profound and primal instinct to stand between the innocent and the fire, a duty she had been denied her entire life. She was no longer a monster, no longer a widow, no longer a curse. She was a force of nature moving against the destruction of another. She reached the inferno's edge, and the heat was a solid wall, a physical entity that tried to push her back. It stole the air from her lungs, seared her exposed skin, and set the very ends of her hair to smoldering. But she pushed through it. The crowd, which had been a solid mass of bodies, broke and scattered before her advance, their gasps lost in the deafening roar of the blaze. She planted her feet in the slush and ash before the blocked entrance, her eyes fixed on the immense glowing timber that held the men captive. It was a dragon of fire and wood, and it was her turn to be the slayer. She did not hesitate. With a guttural cry that was part prayer and part war chant, she lunged forward. Her shoulder slammed against the burning beam. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white-hot agony that shot through her entire body. The wood was not just hot, it was alive, 1,000 burning needles, digging into her flesh through the thick wool of her cloak. The smell of her own burning clothes and skin filled her nostrils, a sickening, acrid scent. For a horrifying second, the beam did not move. It was an immovable object, a final, cruel testament to the futility of her effort. But then, drawing on a reservoir of strength she never knew she possessed, a strength born not of muscle, but of a lifetime of carrying unbearable weight, she pushed. The world held its breath. The beam, groaning like a dying beast, shifted. An inch, then 2. A shower of sparks and burning embers rained down on her, but she held her ground, her face a mask of excruciating effort, her teeth gritted so hard her jaw ached. Her legs, sunk to the ankles in the mud, trembled with the strain, every sinew, every muscle screaming in protest. She was holding back the collapse of a world, a single solitary pillar against an avalanche of fire. Behind her, the trapped men, their faces streaked with soot and disbelief, saw the impossible gap she had created. They did not need to be told twice. They scrambled through one after another, their movements frantic, their eyes wide with a terror that was now mixed with a dawning, incomprehensible awe. The last one through was the elder's son, the young man who had painted the word witch on her barn. He stumbled out and turned, his face a canvas of pure shock, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met Ilara's. In that moment, he did not see a monster. He saw a woman, her face contorted in agony, sacrificing herself for his life. It was a truth so direct, so undeniable, that it shattered the comfortable lies he had told himself for years. He saw his own hatred reflected in the flames that were consuming her, and the sight broke something inside him. He was the last one out. He was safe. Ilara felt the shift in pressure, the slight easing of the weight as the last man cleared the opening. Her strength, which had been a supernova of desperate power, was now fading fast. Her vision began to swim, the edges turning dark. The roar of the fire was replaced by a roaring in her own ears. Her legs finally buckled. With a final, splintering crack that sounded like the sky tearing apart, the main roof of the mill gave way. The beam she had been holding was thrown forward in the collapse, and Ilara was tossed aside like a rag doll, a massive, broken form landing in a heap in the snow just as the entire structure imploded in on itself, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and ash into the black, swirling sky. And then silence. A silence more profound, more complete than any that had come before. The fire still raged, but the human world had gone still. The entire population of Blackwood Hollow stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the dying embers of their future, staring at the motionless giant lying in the snow. They had come to watch a disaster, and they had witnessed a miracle. They had expected to confirm their darkest superstitions, and instead they had been confronted with a grace so profound it felt like a judgment. The monster they had created, the beast they had caged and stoned and starved, had just walked into the heart of hell to save them. Silas was the first to move. He broke through the paralyzed crowd, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He fell to his knees beside Ilara, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her burned and broken body. Her cloak was a smoldering ruin, her skin blistered and raw beneath it. Her face was caked in soot, but she was breathing. Faint, shallow breaths, but she was alive. He ripped off his own coat and gently draped it over her, a futile gesture against the cold and the pain, but it was all he had to give. He looked up at the faces of the villagers, his own face a mask of grief and rage. "This," he said, his voice raw and shaking, "is the monster you feared." The words hung in the cold night air, an accusation and a eulogy, all in one. No one spoke. No one could. They simply stared, their comfortable hatred now a source of deep, burning shame. They looked at the ruins of their mill, the symbol of their survival, and then they looked at the woman who had tried to save it, the woman they had tried to destroy, and they were forced to see the truth. The curse that had plagued Blackwood Hollow was not her unnatural size. It was their own small and fearful hearts. The journey back to the farm was a slow, solemn procession. Several of the men she had saved, including the elder's son, fashioned a makeshift stretcher from fallen branches and their own coats. They carried her with a reverence they would normally reserve for a fallen soldier, their steps careful and sure in the deep snow. The rest of the town followed at a distance, a silent, grieving parade of witnesses. They were not just following a wounded hero, they were following the ghost of their own conscience. Each step was an act of penance, a silent admission of their collective guilt. The days that followed were quiet and heavy. The blizzard passed, leaving the world shrouded in a thick blanket of white, muffling all sound. Inside the small farmhouse, Silas tended to Ilara's wounds. He cleaned her burns with gentle hands, applying a salve of herbs his own wife had taught him how to make years ago. He sat by her side day and night, whispering to her, telling her stories of the farm, of the coming spring, begging her to wake up. He was no longer just her protector. He was her anchor to a world he desperately wanted her to be a part of. He was fighting for her life with the same quiet determination with which he fought the stubborn soil of his land. The first visitor arrived a week after the fire. It was the elder's son, his name Thomas, the same as her lost husband. He stood on the porch for a long time, his hand raised to knock, his courage failing him. Finally, he tapped gently on the door. When Silas opened it, the young man did not meet his eyes. He simply held out a basket. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, a block of cheese, and several jars of potent healing balms. "For her," he mumbled, his voice thick with a shame he could not hide. He thrust the basket into Silas's hands and turned to leave before he could be thanked or condemned. It was the first crack in the wall of ice that had surrounded the farm. The next day, another visitor came. It was the blacksmith, a man whose forge had been mysteriously cold when Silas needed a horseshoe. He carried a set of newly forged hinges for the barn door, their ironwork strong and true. He said nothing, simply set them on the porch and left. The day after that, a woman from the village left a thick woolen blanket, woven with the care of someone trying to undo a great wrong. One by one they came, not with words of apology, for the words would have been too small, too hollow. They came with offerings, with acts of service, with the quiet, humble language of atonement. They were rebuilding the fence they had torn down, not with wood and nails, but with small, hesitant acts of human decency. Ilara was not aware of these offerings. She drifted in a twilight world of pain and memory, her dreams filled with the roar of fire and the ghost of her husband's smile. But the quiet care, the constant, gentle presence of Silas began to pull her back. She woke one afternoon to the feeling of a cool cloth on her forehead and the sight of Silas, asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head slumped on his chest, his face etched with exhaustion. She saw the lines of worry on his face, the calloused hands that had so gently tended to her wounds, and for the first time she felt a love that was not tinged with fear or guilt. It was a quiet, steady warmth, as real and as solid as the earth itself. Her recovery was slow, her body healed, the angry red of her burns fading to pale, silvery scars that mapped her sacrifice. But the deeper healing, the healing of her spirit, came from the quiet rhythm of life on the farm. She would watch from the window as Silas worked, his solitary figure a testament to resilience. She saw the new hinges on the barn door, the neatly stacked firewood on the porch that had not been there before, the small signs that the world outside was changing. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative curiosity. One day, Silas helped her outside for the first time. The winter sun was weak but bright, and the air was crisp and clean. She stood on the porch, leaning on him for support, her great height for once a thing of fragility. As she looked out over the fields, she saw a group of men from the village, working together to clear the stones from a field that Silas had never had the time or strength to tackle alone. They worked in silence, their heads bent to the task. They were not just clearing a field, they were planting the seeds of a new community, one built on the ashes of the old. The true turning point, the final act of her redemption, came with the first thaw of spring. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life pushing through the cold earth. Ilara was strong enough to walk on her own now, and she spent her days in the small patch of land behind the house, the place she had designated for her garden. She was turning the soil with her hands, feeling the life in it, when she sensed she was not alone. She looked up and saw a small child, a girl no older than 6, standing at the edge of the newly mended fence. It was the daughter of the blacksmith. The child stared, her eyes wide, but there was no fear in them, only a profound and solemn curiosity. Ilara froze, her old instincts telling her to hide, to make herself smaller. But Silas, who was nearby, gave her a small, encouraging nod. The little girl took a hesitant step forward, then another. She was holding something in her hand. She walked right up to Ilara, who was kneeling in the dirt, and held out her small fist. When she opened her fingers, a single perfect wildflower, a purple crocus, lay in her palm. It was the first flower of spring. The child looked up into Ilara's face and, with a shy, gap-toothed smile, offered it to her. Ilara looked from the flower to the child's face, and something inside her that had been frozen for a decade finally thawed. She reached out her massive, scarred hand and gently took the flower. Her fingers, which could lift boulders, were so delicate they barely brushed the child's skin. She looked at the small, perfect bloom, a symbol of impossible beauty emerging from the hard, cold ground. And then, for the first time since Thomas had died, a real and genuine smile spread across her face. It was a smile that reached her eyes, lighting them from within, and in that moment, the last bar of her invisible cage simply dissolved into dust. She was no longer the giant widow. She was no longer the witch of Blackwood Hollow. She was Ilara, a woman in her garden holding a flower from a child. She had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscathed but remade. Her strength, once a source of shame, had become a source of salvation. Her size, once a mark of monstrosity, had become a symbol of courage. She had not only saved a town from a fire, she had saved it from itself. And in doing so, she had finally, truly, saved herself. And how many of us in our own lives have been put in a cage, perhaps not one of iron bars, but a cage of judgment, of expectation, of a story that someone else wrote for us. We are told we are too much of one thing, not enough of another. We are labeled, categorized, and made to feel monstrous for the very things that make us unique. We learn to hunch our shoulders, to quiet our voices, to live within the cramped confines of a world's narrow imagination. It is a lonely and painful existence, to be seen but not understood. But Ilara's story is a testament to a powerful, universal truth that even in the deepest, coldest winter of our despair, there is always the possibility of a thaw. There is always a moment when the fire comes, a moment that tests everything we are and everything we believe. It is in that fire that we discover our true strength, a strength not to conquer but to save, not to punish but to forgive. It is in that moment of impossible choice that we find the courage to push against the burning beam, to hold back the collapse, and to step out of the cage forever. The world may build the cage, but we are the only ones who hold the key. The key is not anger, nor is it revenge. It is compassion. It is the courage to offer grace to those who have given us none, to see the humanity in those who have tried to strip us of our own. It is the hardest work a soul can ever do, but it is the only work that truly sets us free. Ilara found her freedom not when Silas bought her, but when she chose to save the very people who had sold her. She found her redemption not when the town finally accepted her, but when she finally accepted herself. Her life with Silas was not one of grand adventures, but of quiet, profound peace. They worked the land together, their shared silence now a comfortable language of love and understanding. The town of Blackwood Hollow was never the same. The fire had burned away more than just their mill. It had cauterized a deep and festering wound of prejudice. The story of the giant widow who became their savior was passed down from generation to generation, a legend to remind them that the biggest monsters are often the ones we create in our own minds, and the greatest heroes are often the ones we are too blind to see. If this story has spoken to a part of your own journey, If you have ever felt trapped by the judgment of others only to find your own strength in a moment of crisis, then share that feeling with us. Write in the comments below, I too have known a turning point. Because every story of survival is a beacon of hope for someone else who is still lost in the storm, waiting for the fire that will finally set them free.